Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Colgen 2010. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, and we're delighted to have you here in Pittsburgh to help us mark the occasion. The show started 10 years ago in the ballroom of a Chicago Marriott hotel. Last year, it was named by Trade Show Week as ranking among the 50 fastest growing trade shows. Over the years, Colgen has convened in San Antonio, Kansas City, St. Louis, Charlotte, Louisville, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, and Columbus. Next year, we'll be back in Columbus, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you there as well. On behalf of Penwell, I'd like to thank the following Colgen sponsors. They include Taggart Global for the badge holders, Robertson Schaefer, Picor, and Clyde Bergman as gold sponsors of our delegate lunches, Land Coast for the aisle signs, and Nuco for the attendee bags. I'd also like to thank Jan Simpson, conference manager, for her efforts to coordinate and produce an outstanding conference program. And special recognition is due to the Colgen Conference Planning Committee, who put together the program you'll be enjoying over the next several days. This is an outstanding committee made up of leaders from across the industry. I'd like to take a minute and ask any of the committee members who are present to please stand up and be recognized for the work that you've done in putting together this year's conference. It's been a few years since the word stranded investment has been uttered. The last time, I think, was during the tumultuous days of deregulation, when utilities were compelled to divest, mothball, and even shutter generating assets. Now the term is reemerging, this time in the context of environmental rules. Teresa Pugh, the American Public Power Association's top environmental expert, briefed a session at the association's annual conference in Orlando in June and said she expects the coal-fired sector to see near constant retrofits between 2012 and 2018, competition for scarce engineering and construction services and equipment, large numbers of unit retirements, possible shortfalls in reserve margin requirements, an increase in natural gas generation, and a chance that financial resources could be misallocated and investments left stranded. Barclays report earlier this year suggested that 27 gigawatts of coal-fired generating capacity could shut by 2014. Filling the generation gap would likely be natural gas, while some in the industry believe the EPA favors natural gas due to its lighter carbon footprint. The cost to switch to natural gas in the U.S. could amount to $355 billion for new combined cycle units, $348 billion for new natural gas pipelines, $12 billion for new natural gas storage facilities, $40 billion for gas gathering facilities, and $8 billion for training and management. Political gridlock on Capitol Hill likely means that EPA will take the lead in regulating carbon emissions through the Clean Air Act. Political watchers noted last year the difficulty of passing any sort of meaningful energy or climate change legislation after July 1st, given the run-up to the November midterm elections. Even after the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, Congress has remained unable to move on energy legislation. One reader of Power Engineering magazine wrote this in a letter to the editor that's being published in our August issue. It is not just the severity of the regulations currently in effect, but the uncertainty of the direction of future regulations that is paralyzing our industry. And Mike Morris, CEO of American Electric Power, took part in a coal executive roundtable discussion that will be published in the September issue of Power Engineering. During that roundtable, he made the following comments. It is clear that this administration is on a path to remove coal-fired electricity from the mix of energy supply in this country. Many of the larger units have already been retrofitted for the Clean Air Act. We will continue, as will others, to invest the capital required to bring them up to whatever standards they can come up with. But in the process, companies like ours will probably shut down 10 to 15 to 20% of our existing coal fleet because these rules are simply not accomplishable at a price point that would make any sense. And in an August 2nd letter to EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott and Chairman of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, Brian Shaw, wrote, "On behalf of the state of Texas, we write to inform you that Texas has neither the authority nor the intention of interpreting, ignoring, or amending its laws in order to compel the permitting of greenhouse gas emissions." So with all that in play, the Colgen Conference Planning Committee extended invitations both to the EPA and the DOE to come address Colgen this morning to discuss regulation and administration policy towards coal-fired generation. Our first speaker this morning is James F. Wood, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Clean Coal, Office of Fossil Energy, Department of Energy. Mr. Wood manages and directs the office's clean coal research and development programs. Chief among these is the Carbon Sequestration Program, the Clean Power Initiative, and the $3.4 billion portfolio of Recovery Act projects. Before joining DOE, he was president and CEO of Babcock Power. From 1996 to 2001, he was president of Babcock & Wilcox, and also was executive vice president of McDermott International, at the time the parent of B&W. Earlier in his career, he was president of WTI International and managing director of Wheelabrator Environmental Systems. He was appointed to the National Coal Council by 3 administrations and is an ASME fellow and trustee of Clarkson University. He holds a BS in chemical engineering from Clarkson and an MBA with a focus on international economics from Kent State University. Please join me in welcoming James Wood.
Yeah, but I didn't think you were going to be so optimistic. So things look that bad, do they? So I'll be here, and hopefully in 10 minutes or so, I'll try and change the attitude of what the future might look like. But it's sure true that if coal-based generation is going to stay as baseload in the United States, the technologies that will need to be put in place for HAPS and for CO2, carbon capture and sequestration, will have to be technologies that are competitive, both in capital costs and operating costs. So I'd like to at least talk a little bit about what DOE is trying to do to stimulate that kind of work. And I'm sure in the Q&A session that follows, we'll have some other discussions that may be more relevant to what you all are interested in. But I want to just recap a bit and talk about the CCPI portfolio of projects that DOE has had some influence in. In CCIP round 1, there were 8 projects that were selected, and 3 are completed. So not a bad, almost 50%, almost a 50% win rate in terms of developing and sponsoring and deploying new technologies. In CCPI round 2, 4 projects were selected, and 3 are inactive or active or completed at this time. And now we're in CCPI round 3. We've selected 6 projects and 5 are active. And I want to talk a little bit about those. And in ICCS, the industrial carbon capture and sequestration, we have 3 projects that we've selected, and 3 projects are actively developing right now. And so just to talk a little bit about the projects under CCPI round 3, I mentioned one in California, which is a $2.8 billion IGCC sponsored by Hydrogen Energy in California. We have a $308 million grant commitment to them. It will be in Bakersfield. It's going to be 75% coal, 25% pet coke, and they are looking to capture 90% of the CO2 and use it for EOR. That project is due to be up and running in 2016. So first generation or maybe second generation of gasification leading to carbon capture being used for EOR. Economics look okay. They're developing the project now, going through NEPA and doing their contracts and so forth. That should be helpful depending on what happens with CO2. The Summit project a project that's sponsored by some venture capitalists, is a $1.7 billion project in Penn, Texas. $350 million commitment, grant commitment on the part of DOE on that project. That's a project which is going to use a water shift reactor, and Fluor is making a commitment to do either Selexol or Rectisol. They're doing the engineering. That project is supposed to be up and running in 2014, so near enough 4 years from now. They're going to capture 3 million tons a year of CO2, also to be used in enhanced oil recovery in the Permian Basin. Then we have two projects, one I'm sure many of you know about, which is the one at the 1,300 megawatt facility for AEP in Mountaineer, which is going to use a 235 megawatt slipstream from that plant to use the chilled amine system that Alstom has for capturing CO2. So we'll get some data and some operating experience there. They're going to inject the CO2 in a deep well on property, which they have some experience in doing. We'll be able to see what happens with the plume. We'll be able to see how you integrate carbon capture with generation on a fairly large unit, and have some decent numbers and some economics to take a look at in terms of the future there. And the last one is the Nrg Project, which we recently awarded, which will be down in Texas. They will have that up and running about 2014, and they're going to capture about 400,000 tons a year, and at this point it looks like they're going to use that for EOR as well. So in terms of the portfolio of demonstration projects, you can see that heavily weighted towards IGCC for new and heavily weighted toward back-end capture and cleanup for old, and we'll have something by the mid-teens in terms of economics and operating data. So that's the demonstration side of it. Then there's a $400 million R&D, more or less, budget every year, which is going to look at the development of sorbents, solvents, looking at compression technologies, looking at membranes for separation of CO2 and membranes for separation of oxygen from air in ways that would reduce the penalty that we now see, which is near enough, I suppose, 25-30% in parasitic load, in order to make these front-end and back-end technologies much more attractive from a levelized cost of electricity point of view. The other thing that we're doing, which is not so much R&D, is we have created a pretty sophisticated model where we're able to do what if on different grids. The one we've picked to initiate this is the PJM grid. And what it will allow us to do in the office is input different pieces of data from the R&D programs and do what if. And the what if is something going to dispatch or is it not going to dispatch? And if it isn't going to dispatch, even with the R&D, think about reorienting the money towards something that's going to actually drive down the long-term cost of electricity, so that at the end of the day we are sponsoring projects and sponsoring technology that is going to lead to a lower cost of electricity, and a cost of electricity that is low enough where the projects and plants will be able to dispatch on a curve that will at least allow them to get enough hours to pay back their investment. I'm sensitive to not only the regulated utilities, and Mike has spoken about what he thinks AEP is going to do, but also the independent power guys, who won't have the opportunity to go back to a commission unless they have a law like the CCPS, the Clean Coal Portfolio Standard that exists in Illinois, where they can go back to the legislature or they can go back to the Illinois Power Authority and can say, look, we're going to do retrofit, we're going to make a clean coal unit. Can we get some rate relief because the costs are so much higher? Most of the IPPs in the United States, which is near enough half of the generation in the U.S. and probably 25% of the coal-fired generation, don't have the ability to do that. So one of my roles is to try and make sure that when DOE is looking to sponsor technologies, we're looking to advance the technologies in a way that is good for not just industrials, not just regulated utilities, but also the IPP folks. And in that regard, I do want to make just an opening statement, and I'm sure David will have other questions about it, about FutureGen. We looked long and hard at FutureGen, and that was one of the things that I looked at from the beginning of the time I went to DOE, which was back at the first of the year, until we made the decision last Thursday to do what a lot of people are saying is great, and then a lot of other people are saying it isn't so great. But I think it's a really good decision and a wise decision for the use of public money. And that was to couple up a repowering at Ameren's Maradosha station with oxy-combustion with the existing Mattoon infrastructure and sequestration that we have in the Mount Simon Formation there in order to do a couple of things. One, oxy-combustion, at least as I understand it, has some promise in terms of what its environmental performance can do. And it has some promise that we ought to at least have in our portfolio. So that was a piece of the decision. Secondly, oxy-combustion is something that looks like it is not only retrofittable, but it is repowerable. And I am concerned, as DOE and as the Office of Clean Coal, I'm concerned about the ability of the existing fleet to be able to retrofit or repower on whatever standards end up coming out of EPA with respect to HAPs and with respect to CO2. Oxy-combustion, at least on a piece of paper, looks like it might offer us the opportunity to retrofit some of that fleet and actually to repower some of the smaller fleet. When we talk about the 100 to 250 megawatt size boilers and size power plants, oxy-combustion, at least with the numbers I've looked at, seems to be sitting somewhere near being competitive, which we didn't have before. And then above the 250 to maybe the 600 megawatt size, maybe oxy-combustion has a place there too, either as a retrofit or, in the case of potentially new plants, playing a role there. So for those reasons, we decided that, look, we have the Summit and HECA projects that we're sponsoring. We have Kemper that is in the loan office, which isn't part of fossil energy, but Kemper has a loan. We see Tenaska is going forward and trying to develop their project. And, of course, we have Duke doing their own project at Edwardsport. We have Wabash that's in operation, and we have Polk in operation. Why do we, as DOE, need another gasification project? We need to add something to our portfolio. So that's the decision that we made, and I'm sure there'll be questions on that, but I just want to let you know what was the basis of that. And so those are my prepared remarks, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and we'll take questions later.
Our next speaker this morning is Dr. Robert Weyland, leader of the Energy Strategies Group for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Dr. Weyland has over 20 years of experience in air quality programs, including experience with EPA's ozone, particulate matter, and air toxics programs. He also was a senior scientist with Science Applications International Corporation's Environmental Science and Engineering Division. In his current position, Dr. Weyland manages the development of air regulations for industrial and utility combustion sources, which are regulated under Sections 111, 112, and 129 of the Clean Air Act. Currently, he is involved in the agency's development of a multi-pollutant emission strategy for the utility sector. Additionally, he is involved in the agency's legislative effort for multi-pollutant controls, which is referred to as the Clean Skies Act legislation. Dr. Weyland received his BA and MS in environmental sciences from the University of Virginia and his PhD in atmospheric sciences from North Carolina State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Weyland.
Thank you, David. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and while I likely will leave you with more, if not many more questions than you had when you came in this room, I'm going to try to give you a picture how over the next 5 to 10 years the agency looks at air quality management and specifically focus these tasks on the coal-fired generation sector. Briefly, I'm going to overview the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. These are the backbone of the regulations for the agency. They're designed to protect public health and the environment, and we will talk about how these will change over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm going to overview specifically some of the upcoming power plant regulations. Many of you are aware that the response to the CARE court remand was issued about a month ago. We refer to that now as the transport rule. We'll talk briefly about that. A topic I know that everyone has an interest in is the upcoming Utility Act, which is court-ordered for March of 2011. We'll talk about that and how that potentially integrates into this. There are 2 actions coming out of the Water Office, which are not directly under my purview, but they do impact the coal-fired sector, as well as another act coming out of the Office of Solid Waste, which is the coal combustion residue regulations. On a similar time frame, we are in the process of responding to a court remand on Subpart DA, which is the NSPS for electric generating units. This piece will specifically deal with NOx, SO2, and PM, and we'll talk briefly about how that factors into all of this. Right now we're working on 5 different national ambient air quality standards. The NO2 standards were put out in January of this year. We just recently finalized the SO2 NACs in June. We're still on schedule to get the revisions to the ozone reconsideration out later this month. And then coming up in early 2011, we have the carbon monoxide and the PM NACs coming forward. As you look at each of these 5 standards, power plants play an integral part in each of these. They're either emitting precursors for ozone or they're emitting particulate matter. They obviously emit SO2 from the coal that's being combusted. So any type of NACs approach that the agency is looking at involves the coal-fired power sector. So we're trying to look holistically at these as well as the MACT regulations and the transport rule as we move forward. There's a lot of detail on these slides. I'm not going to go through it. I told David I wanted to provide it for you so you had a complete timeline in your packets. But essentially the change in the nitrogen dioxide limits was we added a 1-hour NOx standard of 100 parts per billion in the revisions that we did earlier this year. That's a change from what was previously out there. And as you look at the timelines there on the right side of the table, you see the implementation and the compliance with this stretches out almost 12 years. So these are things that are going to be coming into place over the next 10 to 12 years that need to be part of your planning process. And the agency is trying to take that into account as we roll out these different regulations. When we look at the SO2, you see a similar thing. This will play out somewhere between now and July 2017, which is the attainment date. And again, the transport rule is linked to this. The Utility Act will be linked to this. And there are other state-based regulations that help implement these provisions. So as you're doing your planning, as you're looking at the older units, thinking about whether to retire them or thinking about whether to repower them, as Jim's talked about, these are the regulations that you need to be aware of stepping forward. In terms of the ozone, we should have this out later this month. Basically, the big difference there was we're going to add this secondary standard that was proposed back in January. We got a lot of comments on that, and the way ozone attainment works, you can see this spans almost 20 years before the final attainment dates are reached. That depends on whether you're moderate or severe in terms of ozone non-attainment and how this gets implemented over the next 20 years. So here's another layering of regulations that needs to be factored into your planning. When you turn specifically to the power sector, there's a litany of regulations that have either occurred or in the pipeline to come out over the next 9 to 12 months. This started back in March of 2010 with the response to the Johnson memo on BACT. We followed it up in May with the greenhouse gas tailoring rule, which kicks in January of 2011. Just last month, we put out the transport rule, which was the agency's response to the court case. The next thing on the horizon is March 2011, when we'll finalize the proposal for the EGU NSPS for criteria pollutants. That will be linked with the Utility Act, which will be designed to cover toxic air pollutants from these sources. Later in the spring, we will finalize the transport rule, and then in November, we'll finalize both the NSPS as well as the Utility Act. So in about 14 months, the major pieces of the power plant regulations are going to be out and be implemented. We'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the MACT. One of the key issues here is how do we integrate all of these and how do we provide sufficient time to do the retrofits that are necessary to comply with these rules. In the transport rule, it's not a lot different than what was in CARE, but we did deal with the decisions that came in from the court. It covers 31 states plus Washington, D.C. The green states that you see there are subject to both fine particle and ozone standards. The blue states are for fine particles only. The yellow states are for ozone only. And, of course, the white states are not covered by the transport rule. That's because in order to implement the transport rule, we deal with something that we call significant contribution or upwind contribution. And we could only make those determinations in this eastern half of the country. And basically what the transport rule does is it sets an emission budget for each of those 31 states in the Washington, D.C. area. The main thing we had to deal with in the transport rule was making sure that we dealt with the court decision in 2008. And the agency believes that we have done that. The beauty of this, if there is a beauty inside of it, is because it was a remand, the original care provisions remained in place while we worked on the transport rule. So a lot of the equipment that needed to be installed, the scrubbers and the SCRs in these eastern states, was already purchased and already installed. A lot of it was already operating. So we were able to get some of the reductions from care, even though we had to go back and fix some of the things. And as the last bullet says, how are people going to meet? How do we anticipate that the power sector will meet these new rules? A lot of it's going to be operating the equipment that's already installed. And some of it may have to be operated more frequently, like the NOx controls during the ozone season. Some people will switch to Powder River Basin or lower sulfur coal. And a lot of people have installed technologies such as low NOx burners and SCRs, along with wet FGDs. So all of these things are part of the original care rule. They're just going to be sequenced a little bit different now as part of the transport rule. Here we basically have a preferred approach, and we propose two alternatives to take comment on, and the comment period is currently open for this rule. The preferred approach does allow intrastate trading with limited interstate trading. That's a significant change from what was originally finalized in the care rule. And then we have two alternatives where trading is allowed only among power plants within a given state. And then we have a second alternative where we allow that trading within a state and we allow for some averaging among plants in a given state. These are two options we're taking comment on. And as the comment period comes to a close, we'll make a final decision on what to move forward for the final for next year in 2011. Another thing we're doing is we're proposing FIPs, or Federal Implementation Plans. These are designed to ensure that the reductions are gained, and if a state comes up with its own state implementation plan that the agency can approve, then obviously the state plan, once approved by EPA, would supersede the federal plan. Proposal defines upwind state obligations to reduce pollution, significantly contributing to downwind non-attainment areas. And these are based on three factors, which is basically the magnitude of a state's contribution, the cost of controlling that pollution, and the air quality impact of the reduction. And again, this significant contribution aspect is what limits the transport rule to the eastern part of the United States. When you stop and you step back and you think about the task before the agency, we've got NSPS, we have a transport rule, we have utility MACT. How are we going to integrate this and take into account the different facets that are subject to regulation? We're keenly aware of what David mentioned about stranded assets. We do not want to strand a lot of assets and waste a lot of capital in these endeavors. The key components we've identified are on this slide. They're basically three. The first one is energy efficiency. By reducing energy demand, by increasing efficiency, we can lower all emissions. If we burn less fuel in total, then we emit less emissions overall. So energy efficiency is a key component of our integrating strategy. Timing matters. These things have to be sequenced. We don't want to implement a regulation, have controls installed, and then 6 months, 18, 24 months later, we come back with a different regulation that would cause you to rip out what you've just installed. So timing matters. We have to come up with a way that it positively affects investment and keeps you moving in the right direction. And as always with these air regulations, we're trying to obtain significant health and environmental benefits. That's the ultimate goal, is to protect public health and the welfare of the environment. As part of our integrated strategy, we want to transition the power sector to a clean energy economy. And in this clean energy economy, we have basically 5 points that we're striving to accomplish as we move forward. If you're going to build a new plant in the United States today, it's going to be clean and it's going to be energy efficient. You're going to use state-of-the-art controls and you're going to have state-of-the-art efficiency to support it. We're going to use state-of-the-art air pollution controls, and we're going to push the efficiency envelope so that we burn less fuel to generate less overall emissions. We want to help you as companies and vendors and stakeholders to make the proper investments. We want to give you the regulatory future or the regulatory pathway now so that you can understand where you need to be 2015, 2020, 2025. And by doing that, you can make sound business decisions in moving forward. And then by increasing energy efficiency and reducing on the demand side, we can help reduce the cost of regulations for you and the ultimate cost of electricity and natural gas and other things on the American consumer. So this is our vision to transition to a clean energy economy. One of the big rules that's being worked on out of my office right now is the maximum achievable control technology standards for the utility MACT. And it is a key component within the overall integrated strategy for the agency. As we've talked about, the transport rule is part of it, the NSPS will be part of it, and the Office of Water and Office of Solid Waste regulations will also have to be woven into this. Each of these pieces carries its own cost. Each of these pieces carries its own implementation schedule. So the goal we're trying to accomplish here is to integrate these and to make them as seamless as possible. There is no doubt that the utility MACT is going to be a major financial driver for the power sector. It's going to prompt utilities to think long and hard about whether you continue to run a plant, whether you retrofit it, or whether you do something else or shut it down. And we want to prompt those investments, but we want to prompt them in a very smart and intelligent way going forward. In addition, the utility MACT has some very strict legal constraints. The time that you're allowed to comply with MACT and the way that you have to comply with MACT does not have flexibility to a large extent. So we'll talk briefly about that. I'm not going to dwell on this. This is the history that I provided for you, but essentially we started trying to regulate coal-fired power plants in the early 1990s to mid-1990s. It led to a report to Congress in 1998. We had a major information collection request in 1999, and then we made a regulatory decision in December of 2000 that it was appropriate and necessary to regulate coal and oil-fired power plants. We proceeded in 2005 with the Clean Air Mercury Rule, which was challenged in court. The agency lost. The rule was vacated, and thus we were put back into Section 112 to develop maximum achievable control technology standards. As part of that settlement agreement, we have a court order to propose by March 16th of 2011, and the rule will be finalized on or before November 16th of 2011. So it is a very aggressive schedule that we're operating under. When I talked about the legal process, the most important thing to take away from this slide is MACT deals with two types of sources. If you're an existing source out there before March 16, 2011, when this rule is proposed, your emission limitations will be set based on the best performing 12%. So we would take the information we're receiving now plus any historical information, we would rank that and look at the cleanest 12%, and we will set emission limits. And that is what all existing coal-fired and oil-fired power plants will have to meet. If you put a shovel in the ground post this proposal in March 2011, you will be subject to the new source MACT limits. That means you will be subject to meeting the performance level of the single best performing source that's out there in March of 2011. So there are two different distinctions here. This MACT standard, unlike the transport rule, unlike the Clean Air Mercury rule, will be a source-specific standard. There will be no trading among plants or among states. It will be source-specific on a unit-by-unit basis. Who's affected by this? As you can see, roughly 50% of our generation comes from coal. There's another large sector that comes from natural gas as well as oil, and then there's some renewable. But coal is still the baseload generation king in the United States. And as we move forward, we would like to ensure that all of these fuels remain viable for generating power and generating cost-effective electricity in the country. Some of the decision points we're coming to when it comes to the MACT that will have to be briefed up the administration as we move forward In setting the standards, I can assure you we will adhere strictly to the decision of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals on the Clean Air Mercury Rule when it was vacated. There are other decisions, the BRIC-MAC decision, the Cement Kiln Recycling Coalition decision. There are other decisions that have come down in the last 5 years from the D.C. Circuit that will impact this, and we will adhere to those decisions to the nth degree. We're going to have to figure out how to deal with variability. We take a stack test at a coal plant and you get 3 one-hour runs. That may not be representative of how the plant operates in March or December or something. So we have to figure out how we're going to deal with variability. And then we have to consider beyond the floor. The Act requires us to set numerical emission limits for HAP. But if it's cost effective, we're able to go beyond those limits and impose even more controls. Subcategorization will be a key issue. That's a discretionary authority that's in the Act that allows us to split up the coal-fired utility sector into multiple subcategories, set different emission limits for each of those subcategories. Right now, we're following the paradigm that was recently proposed in the Industrial Boiler MAC standard. We're going to have to address all HAP, but we intend to do it by setting 5 surrogacy limits. We will set a mercury standard, a particulate matter standard, an HCl standard, or an acid gas standard, and then we'll deal with total hydrocarbons and dioxin and furans for the non-organic HAP. This is what we did in the Industrial Boiler MAC. We're waiting for that comment period to close on the 23rd of August, and seeing no adverse comments at that time, then we may decide to take this path here. But right now, we're waiting on the comment period to close. The reason we want to use these 5 limits is it reduces cost and it reduces burden, but gives us the coverage that we are covering all the HAP and we are getting the reductions that the regulations are designed to achieve. We needed data. I told you we had an information collection request in 1999. That data now is 10 years old. So we went out earlier this year with like an $80 million information collection request for the coal-fired utility sector. That data is coming in now. We've had some delays with lab testing and things like that. But that data is coming in, and it would allow us to look at subcategorization. It would allow us to look at the best performing 12%. It would allow us to determine what the best performing single facility is out there. All of this information will be compiled and used to generate the proposal that will come out in March of 2011. On the NSPS side, we took a remand on this right after the Clean Air Interstate Rule was litigated. A lot of the information that flowed into the NOx, SO2, and PM 2.5 standards were linked to those regulations. So we've taken a remand on that, a voluntary remand on that. We've relooked at these numbers. And to integrate this with the utility MAC, we're going to be proposing and finalizing these on the same schedule. So they'll be linked together. And with that, I will stop and we'll take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weyland. And as he mentioned, the slides are available. They'll be at the Colgen website, I'm pretty sure. And I know that Power Engineering Magazine will have those available for you so you can look at them as well. But those are in the public domain and you'll be able to look at them. You'll notice that there's a third seat up here on the stage, and the reason for that is that you can lead a tenured professor to the podium, but you can't make him sit there. So our final speaker today is Dr. Frank Clemente, who's professor of social sciences at Penn State University. Dr. Clemente is a senior member of the graduate faculty at Penn State and former director of the university's Environmental Policy Center. His research specialization in the socioeconomic impact of energy policy, especially on families, minorities, businesses, and communities. He's published more than 100 articles in energy-related media. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, by the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. He holds a doctorate in demography from the University of Tennessee, and the senior class of 2008 voted him the best professor at Penn State. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Clemente.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this working? Okay. Okay, good. My explanation not being up here is I have a lot of guys in this room about my age. My advice is get the PSA test for prostate cancers. If you don't have it, get it, because it saved my life. I teach a class at Penn State called Social Problems of the Future. It has about 1,200 kids in it. It's hard to get into. It has a waiting list now of 400, so there's 1,600 kids at the university who want to take it. I start teaching it 2 weeks from today. And it takes a while to get into it, as I said, so you're mostly a senior when you get into the class. Kids want to get an idea what their future is going to be like. And they usually think I'm going to talk about, since it's on social problems, they think I'm going to talk about drugs, alcoholism, war, and I talk about all those things. But I spent a lot of time on energy, because I think energy is one of the major problems their generation is going to have to face. Where are they going to get the kind of energy they need to live in the type of society in which they want to live? And will they be able to afford it anyway? So today I'm going to give you some ideas, first about the global perspective on energy, and then talk a little bit about electricity and where we might be able to get it in the United States. My first slide is always the same, no matter where I talk about energy. Energy's good. We forget about that sometimes in the United States. We're so used to having all the energy we want, and it's been reliable all of our lifetime. We forget that societies, what the impact on societies if they don't have electricity. But societies that do have electricity, people survive childhood. And that's no small thing when 1 out of 5 babies dies before they're 5 years old. They live longer. They drink cleaner water. They eat better food. And they learn to read. Because in the rest of the world, that's what a transmission line looks like. And the people that benefit the most when electricity comes to a village, farm, or community are women. Women and children. Their life changes that day, the day electricity shows up. We know this from our own experiences with rural electrification in the United States. Some of you may have been impacted by rural electrification. Think of the TVA and how people's lives in 7 states changed the moment electricity came to the farm. But I don't have to read a history book to understand about the impact of electricity. I saw it happen before my very eyes. My wife and I have 8 children. And 4 of them were adopted from overseas, from places that don't have a lot of electricity. And when one of our boys came to us, he was 6 years old, and he can tell stories about going to the bathroom in a hole in the ground, having no refrigeration, having no light, having no running water, cooking in a little charcoal stove in a hut. When he joined our family, he was 6 years old. He weighed 35 pounds. Today, 20 years later, with the benefits of electricity and all it can bring, he's a United States Marine with 2 combat medals for bravery under fire. That's what electricity can do to change lives. In fact, electricity is so good. First of all, I've got to get the electricity to work to change the slide. Okay. Everybody wants it. There's a few people in the room that have been around the block like me many times. Well, when we grew up and we were getting out of college, the electricity demand around the world was that little baby over there. And when our kids graduated from college, it was just a little bit more than that little cheerleader. And when our grandkids graduate from college, it's going to be that giant. That's the scale of electricity growth around the world. That's demand. That's the need for power. And just to give you an idea what the demand that still exists and the latent demand that's out there, there's the scale of global poverty and energy deprivation. We've got 2.5 billion people that live on less than $2 a day. 2 billion people have electricity on a relatively sporadic basis, let's say inadequate access. They might only have it a few hours a day or a few days a week, or it might cost too much to use all the time. And we have another 1.5 billion people that have no electricity at all. Now, when you don't have electricity, that just doesn't mean you can't play Sudoku on your computer. That means you have no electricity. You have no refrigeration. You have no light to read by. You've never taken a hot shower. That's what the world really looks like outside of this room. In that context, I was down in Houston giving a speech at Exxon, and one guy in the back of the room said, looks like we're going to have to need everything, everywhere, all the time. That struck with me a bell, so I included it. We need everything. That's why this battle between natural gas and coal and nuclear, it makes no sense. We need all this stuff. We need power. We need electricity. If we take this whole issue of poverty seriously and energy deprivation seriously, we need everything. And the world's turned into coal. By 2030, about 4 billion people will get 40%, at least 40% of their electricity from coal. Coal is on the rise all around the world. And it makes sense because coal's where the people are. If you look at energy, you want to talk about an energy secure fuel, coal was the epitome of a secure fuel. A very handful of people control the oil, not a little handful control the natural gas. But 42% of the people control 50% of the coal. Coal's a secure fuel, and people are increasingly seeing it as so. The other value of coal is its versatility. Not only you can produce electricity from coal, you can produce liquid fuels, you can produce substitute natural gas, petrochemicals. Coal's crucial to be making steel. And some countries are going to need a lot of steel, like China, where they're moving 1 billion people to cities, and they build up, not out. China understands this whole issue. I spent a month in China in June. I learned a lot. And I talked to the person that's writing the next 5-year plan, the energy component of it. And in one province, they're going to produce an additional 1.2 billion tons of coal. In one province. That's adding the United States. That's the United States. And they're going to convert it to all kinds of different things, not just electricity, but all these other products that can be produced from coal. In fact, you cannot get a permit to mine in Xinjiang province unless you have a coal conversion plant associated with it. And China has benefited from their use of coal. That red line is the coal generation. The blue line, the blue bars, are people taken out of poverty. And those, by the way, are hundreds of millions of people. Coal works in China to pull people out of poverty. 85% of all the people taken out of poverty in the last 20 years in the whole world are in China. 85%. And when you're talking about poverty in China, you're not talking about, I didn't get my food stamps or rent subsidy didn't show up. You're talking about real poverty. $2 a day poverty. Now, people like to beat up China, particularly the New York Times. But let's look at what China's doing. They're building some of the most efficient coal-fired power plants in the world, and they're taking their smaller plants offline. They have a program called Large Substituting for Small. They're putting in large, supercritical power plants, and they're retiring small, inefficient coal power plants. This is going to make a difference in and of itself in emissions across the world. The most efficient power plant in the world right now is in Shanghai. And they're building more of them all the time. That's their plan. Efficiency. China's an old story. Let's look at the next chapter in the book. Here comes India, which in 6-7 years will have more people than China. India needs coal energy too. They will get it. They have some coal resources. They're going to import from Australia. India has 400 million people who have no electricity. They have 600 million people, 2 times the population of the United States, that cook with wood or dung. You know what dung is. And this is an amazing statistic to me because I checked it about 7 or 8 times. It's true. They have 900 million people who have no refrigeration. India's going to use coal. They're going to use coal-based electricity. So most of the demand for new coal, incremental coal, will be coming out of Asia. About 97%. Virtually all of it, really. It's a pretty big set of demand coming out of there. But even after all that, even building all these coal power plants, and moving all that forward, it's still not enough. We need more. Right now we have 1.5 billion people that do not have electricity. Well, guess what? In 2030, we're still going to have 1.3 billion. This is why there was no real, everybody expected this gigantic agreement in Copenhagen. That's why, right there. That's why there's that line in there which everybody should make sure they read. The first priority of developing nations is the eradication of poverty. We're not going to get there even close without coal. Now, you think about the United States. Where are we going to get electricity? I think about this a lot. Because this is where I started sort of my career. Nuclear power plants, electricity system planning, working with Ted Nagel at AEP. Well, this is where we get our electricity now, in that top bar. And then the bottom bar is where we're going to get it according to the EIA in 2035. Now you might say, well, same old, same old. Coal's still going to be a major contributor, a little less than it was now. Natural gas hanging around the same, nuclear dropping off a little bit, and wind will be more of an important. That's what the EIA tells us. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody else does. But that's what the EIA says it's going to look like in 25 years. There's where coal stands in the United States. 36 states get at least 25% of their electricity from coal. The states with the yellow dots, they get 45%. Coal is a crucial part of our quality of life, all across the heartland of this country. And it will remain so if we want electricity that we can afford. Clean coal technology works. There's no such thing as clean coal. No, clean coal technologies work. They take time, but sooner or later they get a foothold. We've used more coal now than we did, and we need less regulated emissions. We can use technology on our side. That's our advantage. Now we have a big challenge. Secretary Chu said one of the biggest challenges we faced in this regard. And he's right. That blue line is where our CO2 emissions have gone. In 2008 or so they peaked, or whenever. And now they're supposed to drop off a cliff, according to policy, by 2050. Now you have everybody has their own opinion whether it can be done or whatever, and I'm not going to get into that debate. But the context is important. We have a policy that we're pursuing that says we're going to drop that blue line down by 2050. At the same time, we increase the population by 150 million people. And if you lived in this country in 1953, when we had about 150 million people, you know what it was like then. I was there. You can add another 150. By the way, you're also going to increase GDP by 170%. Now, you can have a debate all day and argue for weeks on whether this is possible. But that's the context that our policy, in which our policy is set. We know we're not going to get the new coal energy, electricity. That's coal plants that were planned. We've canceled about 100 gigawatts of coal plants that were planned, and many of them approved, and the need for power statements were signed by the Public Service Commissions, so they needed the power. And I think we're going to pay a price for that. I really do. You know, that's one of the problems of one generation deciding what's going to happen in the next generation. The generation that I'm part of decided we weren't going to build nuclear power plants. So now we don't have any real nuclear power plant industry. It comes right down to it. But I guarantee you, my students at Penn State, they'd like to have nuclear power plants. I think we're going to face the same thing with coal plants. People are going to say, why the hell didn't you build those coal plants? We're paying a fortune for electricity, and we don't have enough anyway. So what are we doing? We're building natural gas plants everywhere. A couple of years, there'll be 500 gigawatt of natural gas plants in the United States. And we've got more on the way. A couple of mentionings up here of movement more toward natural gas. Even more natural gas plants. Colorado said we're going to turn our coal plants into natural gas plants. Well, so other states doing it too. This all isn't going on in a big vacuum. Now, I was in Texas just giving a speech the other day. They said they're expecting a battle in their legislature on people saying, well, let's turn our coal plants into natural gas. We've got plenty of natural gas. Now, look at this slide for a second. 500 gigawatts now. Who knows how many are going to be built in the next decade? And compare this to the next slide. This is what the EIA tells us. Now, there's some intellectual dissonance between that slide I just showed you and this slide. These two are totally incompatible. The EIA, the Energy Information Agency, which is administration, which supposed to tell us what's going to happen in the future, or at least gives us an idea, is telling us that our natural gas supply is going to decline by 4%. We're building natural gas plants like crazy, but our natural gas supply is supposed to decline. Now, who knows what's going to happen? Shale gas may or may not show up. That may be 4, maybe 5 TCF. I don't know. We're pretty sure that the conventional bar there, that red one, that's pretty much written in stone because that's sort of a natural phenomenon taking place. We know we're going to get the red. Whether we get the green or not, who can say? We just keep building the same kinds of plants, assuming the fuel is going to show up. And we've done this before, by the way. That's why the capacity factor for natural gas plants is only about 35%. But yet 90% of the power plants we built in the last 10 years were natural gas. We thought natural gas industry said, oh, we're going to get plenty of natural gas. In 2000, they said it's going to come from offshore. No problem. Well, that didn't show up. 2003, they said, oh, it's going to be coming from conventional. Well, that didn't show up. 2006, 2007, 2008, they said plenty of LNG on the way. Well, guess what? That didn't show up either. Now they're saying the shale gas will have coming out our ears. We'll see. Their track record ain't that good. Now, shale gas. Everybody thinks I'm opposed to shale gas because I write questions about shale gas. In the society we live in, you're either Michael Moore or you're Rush Limbaugh. Okay? There's no middle ground. But I'll say this. We need shale gas. We're counting on it. And the resources out there. No question about it. But there's some big-time questions. First of all, how much is it going to cost? We don't know. How much can be delivered in a timely fashion? We don't know. Environmental impacts? We don't know that either. That's why the EPA is doing a study right now. They don't know. All I know is 1,200 people showed up down here in Cannonsburg in 90-degree weather, which felt like 900. 90-degree weather to complain about the environmental impact of shale gas. Shale gas is going to, any natural gas power plants are going to require carbon. If you believe in that slide where they had the big dip to 2050, then you have to support carbon capture for natural gas plants. That's the only way you can get there. You cannot get to that goal using natural gas without carbon capture. You can't do it. So we're going to have to employ. And who knows how much it's going to cost I mean, it's feasible to capture carbon from natural gas, same as from coal, same basic technology. But think about where all the natural gas, all these little wee natural gas plants scattered all over the place. No pipelines or anything near them. How much is that going to cost? Life cycle analysis? Don't ask us. We don't know much. We don't know what the impact, we don't know how much methane is leaking from the natural gas production systems. We have no idea. According to the New York Times, in the whole state of Texas, all these gas wells, oil wells, there's 2 instruments owned by the state that can measure methane releases. 2. And how many thousands upon hundreds of thousands of wells do they have? We don't know how much methane is being released. And it all depends on who you talk to as to how much is being released. And there's no real, we use right now the 100-year metric, where we say a molecule of methane is 22 times more powerful than a molecule of carbon dioxide in terms of natural gas, in terms of greenhouse gases. But that 100 years is just a policy decision. There's no science behind it. It could be 20 years. A 20-year metric, the whole ballgame changes. Now it's 72 times. You find lots of scientists that say, well, there's no real reason why it's 100 or 20. That's a decision made by politicians. We have to start measuring methane. That may be the natural gas or the greenhouse gas we should be most concerned about. Bridge to what? Stranded investment was mentioned up here. It's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to build these. People say, well, natural gas is a bridge. Well, where's it a bridge to? More plants standing idle? Because they're too expensive to run? And any shortfall in liquefied natural gas and shale gas, by the way, we're in the LNG market. And who owns the natural gas around the world? 40% of it's owned by Iran and Russia. That's a market we don't want to get into. The National Energy Technology Lab, they do some great work down here in Pittsburgh, and they have a line that still haunts me. It'll be the first time in history that our electrical supply system could be dictated by the whims of foreign producers. Think about that sentence when you think about electricity. Because price matters. Price makes a difference. Those 2 lines going up are the price of natural gas for industry and the price of electricity for industry. It's going up. It's gone up. Natural gas has kicked up the price of electric generation, of electricity. No question about it. Not just for industry, but for consumers too. Slide going down? Well, that's manufacturing jobs. Those are real people's jobs that lost their jobs. I'm not saying there's a one-to-one correlation up here. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying this is what happened. And you'll talk to a lot of manufacturers, including the CEO at Dow Chemical, who says one of the reasons that happened was the price of natural gas. Nuclear power plants? Well, as I mentioned, that's where I sort of started my career, working. I was helping to plan nuclear power plants back in the 70s. I'm a full believer in nuclear power plants. I'd get a shovel tonight and start building a nuclear power plant if I could. But we're not going to build them. I mean, we're fooling ourselves if we think we're going to have some onslaught of nuclear power plants to solve our problems. It's not going to happen. The world passed us by. That ship sailed for us, I believe. I can only speak from my personal experiences at Penn State. We had one of the major nuclear engineering departments in the United States and in the world. I had a joint appointment in that department. I was just a sociologist. What's a sociologist doing in nuclear engineering? Nobody knew, but I was there anyway. And in that department, they had Joe Palladino, who was the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They had Forey Remnick, who was a member of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They had Warren Witzik, who was an assistant to Admiral Rickover, the founder of the Nuclear Navy. They were all members of that department, but they're all dead. And they weren't replaced. In fact, at Penn State, we have the longest continuously running nuclear power plant on any campus anywhere. And we don't have a nuclear engineering department anymore. It was folded into mechanical. That's the status of our nuclear engineering right there. That tells you a lot. I tell my students, don't forget, it's a 7-card stud game. You looked at your first 3 cards, 2 in a hole, 1 on top. 2 are aces, the one on top's an ace 2. You got 3 aces to start the game. 2 of them are coal, 1 of them is natural gas. You got to decide whether you're going to use those resources and how you're going to use them. So that ends my remarks, and I'll hang around to ask you questions if anybody wants to.
We asked our committee members from the Colgen Conference Planning Committee to submit questions that we're going to use the rest of our time this morning to address to our panel. Before we begin, just let's thank them again for their formal presentation this morning. Let's begin, if you don't mind, with a question on greenhouse gas regulation. And I'd like to get your assessment of whether it's better for Congress to regulate greenhouse gases or whether it's better for EPA, and reasons for that. You want to begin?
Not really, but I'll give it a try. I'm sort of on the side that Congress ought to do this, and the reason I'm on that side is that Congress ought to represent, and I realize that sometimes it does polarize, but it ought to represent the general basis under which the United States economy works. And I don't think it ought to leave to an administration this particular regulation, because this particular regulation has 2 sides to it: those who believe in the science and those who don't believe in the science. I think Congress has got to grapple with that and got to deal with it.
I don't necessarily disagree with what Jim's saying. I think the agency position is we wholeheartedly support comprehensive energy and climate legislation. We feel as we transition to this clean energy economy, it's the most stable way to generate jobs and generate smart investment in the power sector. That being said, as we've heard here today, there's not any real active movement on the legislative front. The agency has the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which require us to do certain things in a statutory manner. So until such time that this comprehensive legislation arrives, we're somewhat shackled with implementing the Act, as it was written in 1990. So we will continue to do things like the Transport Rule, the Utility Act, and the Tailoring Rule in January, and continue down that path. But the agency administration would wholeheartedly support some type of comprehensive energy and climate legislation.
And a requirement from the Supreme Court decision from a couple of years ago also that compels action.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's very correct.
Yeah, I just say I'm more for Congress taking the lead on that. We elect them to do something, so they may as well do something down there.
Mike Morris made the comment that I quoted earlier about believing that the administration is moving towards pushing coal out of the equation. Is the administration anti-coal? Is the EPA anti-coal? How do you respond to that? How do we know one way or the other? That's sort of a touchy-feely kind of question. Do they really like us or not? And the question is, what does EPA think about coal, and what does the administration and DOE think about coal?
Well, I think in terms of EPA's approach, you can look at the recently proposed Industrial Boiler Act, where we kept all fuels there viable and on the table. There were regulations for coal, there were regulations for natural gas, there were regulations for biomass. In any type of regulatory effort, we look at all sides of the coin to make sure that we're keeping a level playing field and moving these regulations forward. I don't think the agency has a position either pro or anti-coal, pro or anti-natural gas. It's just we're implementing the statute as it's written and moving forward in those directions. So in this upcoming utility MAC, yes, that is focused on coal and oil because we did not list natural gas-fired power plants in 2000 when that decision was made. But I think the agency is looking for a diverse integrated fuel mix as we move forward, primarily to provide cost-effective electricity and reasonable natural gas prices across the board. So that's how I would answer that. Can you speak a bit more about why EPA didn't include natural gas a few years ago? Why was natural gas left out? What was the thinking there? In the original report to Congress in 1998, the most serious hazardous air pollutant that was identified was mercury, was the HAP of greatest concern. And in general, in natural gas, you don't find a high degree of mercury. So it was focused on coal, and then, of course, there are some non-mercury metals that are emitted from oil combustion, so that those sources were listed as well. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Wood, the Department of Energy and its view on coal, and I'm sorry, on natural gas versus coal. Pro natural gas?
Look, the budget that I'm monitoring and spending is $3.4 billion of public money in support of technologies to make coal a cleaner burning fuel, and $400 million a year of R&D, applied and basic, to research facilities, including NETL and the other national labs and universities around the United States for the purpose of developing products and technologies that will make coal cleaner. So I can't, people may feel that there's a bias one way or the other, but certainly in my office there's a bias, and it's to coal.
Renewable energy is getting a tremendous amount of press and a lot of popularity in the popular media. Do you have a sense, or do you have some thoughts on the potential penetration that renewables could play in the overall generation mix, and what's an appropriate level of penetration for renewables given the demands on the electricity supply in the U.S.?
Well, I have a thought, and that is for every megawatt of renewable, there has to be a megawatt of capacity. Renewables are nice for energy. That's good. If renewables are working because the sun shines and the wind blows, that's great. You can have a megawatt of renewable, but when that doesn't happen, you need another megawatt somewhere that's going to work in place of it. So I see base load continuing. I see the United States is going to do exactly what it did in 2002, 3, and 4, which is going to do absolutely nothing in terms of building power plants until all of a sudden we have an emergency because the economy has picked up, the capacity factors now are high, the margin goes away again. We need to build power plants in order to support the demand, and the only thing you can get built, the only thing you can get permitted is going to be gas. We'll rush to gas, the price of gas will go back up, then we'll stop building gas, we'll have stranded assets again. Well, somehow or other in the United States, it's either all the way over here or all the way over here. We never seem to get ourselves centered. And I think a good comprehensive energy policy might do that, but I don't see one.
Yeah, I agree with everything Jim said. I think, who's against renewables, I guess maybe until you go walk along one of these ridge lines where they have all the wind turbines, then you may get against them if you see the damage they've done up there on the top of those hills. But the whole issue is, to me, there's two components of it. One is reliability, and they're intermittent. When's the day that the wind is least likely to blow? The hottest day of the year. That's why it's hot. You're not going to have a lot of wind those days, so you got to have backup. And that backup's going to be natural gas de facto or de jure. Who knows? In Colorado now it's de jure. So you're going to have some kind of backup. And cost. How much is it going to cost? I mean, have you ever looked at a map where the wind is and where the load is? And you see all these states between North Dakota and New York and Philadelphia? Can you imagine how many lawsuits are there? You ever try to cite a transmission line? And how many years it takes? There's a lot of lawsuits between North Dakota and the Pennsylvania border.
Dr. Weyland, during your presentation, you talked a bit about the timing of the rules and their implementation. I'm interested in seeing if you could get into a bit more detail about how EPA thinks about when these rules are going to take place, and then how the industry can respond, and what efforts is EPA taking to help the industry be able to time its investments so they can both meet the requirements and also plan their capital investment.
Okay. That's a perfectly fair question. All of these regulations we're talking about have public notice and comment records after the proposals come out. And as you saw in the transport rule, the agency puts forward a preferred approach, and then we have two alternative approaches. And it's through this open dialogue process where the affected stakeholders and the regulated entities out there come back to the agency and say, yes, we can do this in this time frame, or we cannot do this in the time frame that's out there. And then we have to try to come to some happy medium to affect the change in the final rule. In the MAC program, there's not a whole lot of flexibility, but we are aware going into that rule next March that the 3-year compliance window or even the 4-year compliance window has some potential ramifications to the power sector. And so we're trying to deal with that between now and March, and we'll probably have different preferred approaches and options in that rule from which to take comment on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But as some of the equipment is retrofitted, there are different control levels for some pollutants and for others. And depending on when those come in, how does the timing work on those and being able to effectively use those assets, those controls?
In developing any of these regulations, we look at multi-pollutant control, we look at co-benefit analyses. For example, in those eastern 31 states in the District of Columbia, there are going to be scrubbers going in as part of the transport rule. Well, when we're looking at the utility MAC and the ability of scrubbers to reduce acid gases to meet that potential HCl limit, we account for what's already been put on the books in the transport rule. And we levelize those costs and we spread them out. We don't count the cost twice. We don't count the benefits twice. So we attempt to look at all of that, and that's part of this integrated vision of transitioning to a clean energy economy, is to look at how all of these pieces interlink and go together so that we do prevent stranded assets and we maximize the financial investment by each entity complying with the rule.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Wood, during your presentation, you talked a bit about FutureGen and the technology or the award that was made last week. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how the economics are beginning to work out. Do you have a sense both of the timing for the technology and also the economics? We've heard in some instances that there could be a 1/3 energy penalty in order to use carbon capture technologies. What's the latest understanding that you have on the technologies?
So let's consider that what's being deployed today in the projects I mentioned, as well as the projects that are being deployed privately on the IGCC side. We know that those plants that are using oxygen are using an air separation unit, and we know that the capture of CO2 requires compression in order to sequester the CO2 underground. CO2 becomes a liquid-like substance at about 1,800 pounds. And it will need to be supercritical to be put underground. In fact, most of the studies that DOE has done looks at supercritical CO2 underground to understand what happens when it's sequestered. That penalty, those two large penalties, the air separation unit and the CPU, the CO2 cleanup unit and pressurization, is about 30% of the parasitic load. It's terrible. The economics are horrible. But the things that DOE is trying to sponsor in universities and in laboratories are things that should drive that cost down. Membranes, for example, that can separate O2 without compression penalty and compressor technologies that can compress CO2 at half or even possibly more than half a savings in the parasitic load are under study today. They're better than bench scale. I've seen some of them. They're almost ready to deploy. So second generation and third generation deployment of these technologies in the 2015 to 2020 area should give us better economics that we have now. In fact, in the modeling that we do, it looks like those economics will actually be economics where these systems will be able to be in service. They'll actually be able to be deployed in service. So it's going to take time, and it's going to take more money, and it's going to take some help from industry, but I think we can get there, and I think we can get units that will be dispatchable and can burn coal and can use coal, but it's going to take some time, another 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a bit about the White House CCS task force and what you hope that will be able to accomplish?
My knowledge of that is a little bit limited, although Jim Markowski from the Office of Fossil Energy was one of the co-chairs, so he did share some of that with us. But my understanding is the report is done, the report is in OMB, it's being reviewed by OMB, and hopefully it'll be out this month.
That's consistent with the agency's understanding.
Do you think, and Professor Clemente, you touched on this a bit, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it also, as well as Mr. Wood and Dr. Weyland. Is the U.S. losing engineering capability and resources that it needs to be able to design, build, and operate cleaner coal power plants that are going to be needed in the future? What's your sense of the state of the industry?
Well, both of these guys probably have a little better sense than me, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case as much as it was, say, with nuclear power. I think that there's still a huge amount of expertise in the United States. But I will say that these other countries are moving forward with some of these clean coal technologies, and that's why I'm glad we're moving forward. And the whole concept of efficiency, I think efficiency is a really big deal. I mean, National Coal Council years ago indicated we could get like 50,000 megawatts by making our power plants more efficient here in the United States. I mean, that's still a door it's open. So I think that's one area where I do agree with my other speakers. Is a number of them, but efficiencies, it's really important. That's the direction China's going. They're going to make a difference. China will make a difference in greenhouse gas emissions by this efficiency program.
Dr. Weyland, your thoughts on engineering capabilities?
Sure. We have heard those suggestions that the infrastructure is no longer available domestically, that it's all gone offshore in China and India and other locations. As part of this integrated strategy that the agency's putting forward for these regulations, we're actively seeking labor, construction material, vendor-type information to make sure that whatever we would require in the Utility Act and some of these subsequent rules, that the infrastructure is there to supply the need. In the event when these analyses are done, if the infrastructure is not there, that obviously would guide, how we go about implementing the rule. But we are working closely with other federal agencies and with outside vendors and stakeholders to try to totally understand what is available and what is not available domestically, say between now and 2015, 2016, when all these rules will come into play.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Wood, your thoughts?
Well, I have a couple of things I could say. First of all, because I sit on a board of trustees at a university that's a technical university for the most part, I see applications and the data that come in year after year. And since 2007, we've seen a tremendous uptick in interest on the part of high school students that want to pursue engineering. So I think that's a good sign. Part of it is due to the fact that when people thought they were pursuing financial engineering, they were going to get rich. And now it's not such a great thing anymore for students. So that I see a lot of uptick in that. I think that's very good. In the office, we have a number of young people that are in either as interns or first or second year people. Many of them from Penn State, very well educated, understand the business, are learning something about how government works. So they're going to take this experience and go on the outside, and I think that will serve us well. Yeah, the retirement rate from businesses that manufacture and design products for the energy industry, the retirement rate is up. It's up in utilities. Mike Morris would be able to tell you this better than I, but he had a tremendous layoff not too long ago. Southern Company doesn't have very good numbers this year. It's all because of the recession. So there is a problem there in terms of how you're going to repopulate the power business, I would say. The economics of the IPPs is not good, and how that might play into a future of people being interested or not interested in the power business, that's a problem. But I think at least the entry level looks good. If the exit looks higher, it'll catch up with itself. I don't agree that there is much left of infrastructure in the United States to manufacture. I have some experience in that area. Just before I left the company I was with to come to DOE, we made the decision to shut down our Erie, Pennsylvania plant. And we did it because it was not economical to manufacture anything there. B&W, when I was with B&W, we shut down the Paris works. B&W still operates in Mississippi, and they still operate their Canadian works. But I don't think that Foster Wheeler manufactures anything more in the United States. Everything's offshore. And all of the new stuff, if it ever gets built, will be built in Asia because it's cheaper. It's cheaper, and the quality is just as good as it would have been in the U.S. Now, there is infrastructure in the U.S. to do what we would call the service business, the aftermarket business. There's plenty of manufacturing still left to do that. And if we get together on a policy and begin to promote clean coal in the ways that I think we can do this, we will see a rebirth in that industry because those kinds of technologies will naturally grow in the United States if there's a market.
And looking forward to, say, 2020, 2030, what sorts of performance would you expect coal-fired power plants to be able to demonstrate? What does a coal-fired power plant have to look like in order to be viable in the market 2020, 2030?
Near zero.
Near zero?
Near zero.
Near zero on?
Everything.
On everything.
On near everything. Zero and low water usage. And I think we'll get there.
And efficiencies probably in the mid-40s, probably.
Well, one would hope, but we'll see what happens with the compression. But yeah, it would be nice to be in the mid-40s. I mean, even on the issue you brought up earlier, on ultra supercritical, I'm waiting for the industry to give themselves the materials that they're going to need to go to 1100 and 1150, because those materials are available in other parts of the world. China's building high temperature single reheat units. I don't know why we don't do it here. Maybe they don't have a NEPA process. I don't know.
Is near zero economically achievable? And one issue that comes into play, of course, is that so much electric power generation is regulated by public utility commissions that have to look out for affordability issues. Is zero achievable economically, do you think?
I think in the time frame you've outlined, the 2020, 25, 2030, yes, it is achievable.
I just like to add, I think that we need to think about the world natural gas fits into this too, and the same standards. It has to be a level playing field. I mean, I've been reading a lot about these methane emissions. This is not a small thing. This is significant. We don't have any idea how much methane is being released through this process of drilling all these shale gas wells, piping the natural gas somewhere and using it. And we don't have the numbers. It has to be a level playing field, I think, for natural gas. You have to submit natural gas if you want to get the carbon capture. You want to get the CO2, as I said. Just in talking about CO2, you're going to have to put carbon capture and storage on natural gas. And you've got natural gas plants scattered everywhere. Well, you're not going to get that policy. You're not going to reach it. Can't get there with gas. Even the Sierra Club says that.
And while this conference is focused on coal, of course, natural gas does have a carbon footprint and falls simply by the nature of the gas and the fact that it does emit carbon. It still would fall under regulation, would have to meet the same regulations that coal-fired plants would have to meet.
We're kind of myopic on the carbon dioxide. I mean, I go back to methane. Natural gas is 90-some% methane. That's a powerful greenhouse gas. If we were focusing on more greenhouse gas, there's no way you can argue that natural gas is 50% cleaner than coal. You can't do it. And be scientifically accurate, I believe.
Those were the questions that we had for our panelists this morning. If you would, please join me again in thanking Jim Wood from the Department of Energy, Dr. Robert Wayland from the Environmental Protection Agency, and Frank Clemente from Penn State University.